It's wonderful to be here in this new building, and what the building represents, of course, is far grander than this already grand building, and to play some role in helping us think about some of the vital questions of the age. My thanks in particular to Lynn, Toddy, and all the other co-sponsoring units of the school that have made my time with you possible. And I'm also pleased to be returning to Elon in literally a couple of weeks for the dedication of this building, and I'm looking forward to that as well. I hope you don't have buyer's remorse. It's like, oh, we already heard him once. He was awful. So I'm going to try to do a really good job. So now I have been working for some years now on a book, which is thankfully nearing conclusion, on a topic that has been causing me growing frustration. The topic has to do with how Christians, in particular, have variously taken up questions about the meaning of religious diversity. Perhaps the oldest way Christians have struggled with that question about the nature of religious diversity is to ask something like the following question: can persons find salvation outside of the church? A more Jesus-centered way of putting that question is, can we be saved by other means than by faith in Jesus Christ? Some version of these questions have been asked from the earliest centuries of the Christian tradition. In contemporary Christian theology, there's now an entire subdiscipline dedicated to the formulation of a question that seems very much like the older ones. Very much, and I want to emphasize seems. And that question I'll get to in a moment. Let's see if I can, well, I'll skip ahead to this. And the way that the contemporary theologians pose this question is, can other religions lead persons to salvation? Or is salvation found in the Christian religion alone? Do you notice a difference between the older ways of putting the question and the contemporary way? Right? The contemporary way has this word religion in it. The older versions of the question make no reference to the notion or the category of religion. And I think we can say with some confidence that neither Jesus nor any New Testament author, nor perhaps even any person in the first 1,600 years of Christian tradition, had any conception of religion that resembles our own. So this likely means that we think we're asking a question that is like the older ones, but is also strikingly new, and news in ways that we have not appreciated. Now, the subdiscipline that has taken up this question goes by various names, but is most commonly called theology of religions. I teach courses in this field and write in this field as well. It goes by a variety of names, including also theology of religious pluralism, though I think probably we ought to start calling it theology of religious diversity. I would also prefer that the central question for the field be reformulated, and you'll see why over the course of this lecture, to something like, what is the theological meaning and significance of religious diversity? That question seems to me to be far better than, do other religions lead to salvation? When that latter question is framed, it's usually put as, framed metaphorically, it's usually put as a question in religious mountain climbing, as Lynn mentioned, right? Are the world's religions paths up the same mountain? That has been the structuring question for this subdiscipline. And for reasons that you shall soon see, I'm not persuaded that this is a very helpful way of going about the core work of this field. Now, the good news is that this subdiscipline is growing by leaps and bounds and is no longer a Christian field. There are now serious, major book-length contributions from Buddhist, Jewish, Muslim, and Hindu thinkers, all asking this question, but from the perspective of traditions other than the Christian tradition. So in that sense, there is robust growth in this field, and no single person can master all the books that are available even within this subdiscipline any longer. Now, much of the debate within this area has been framed and shaped into three options that have now become part of standard theological discourse. The names of these options or models are usually familiar to advanced undergraduates, seminarians, and many pastors. Probably you've heard these terms, at least some of you. They are exclusivism, inclusivism, and pluralism. How many of you have heard of these terms? Yeah, see, a significant number of you have heard of these three sort of major options in the theology of religious pluralism. More recently, a fourth model has been added into this typology, variously called particularism, or the acceptance model. That term is probably still new enough that many of you have not heard it. Anyway, the debates within this field have usually taken the shape of which of these models for thinking about the question, are the world's religious traditions paths up the same mountain? Which of these models is most adequate? Now, today I want to actually run through somewhat quickly those four options and suggest that all four options have critical problems, very serious flaws. Now, if every major option or family of options within a tradition within an academic subfield has a problem about it, one wonders whether the question that's being asked is the right question. So one way to substantiate that I don't think we're asking the right question is to say, well, none of the major options anyway, seem to work. And what can we tell about the fact that none of the major options work, and why do they all break down as they do? I've already, of course, given away the end of the story in a certain sense, because I think you've already gathered from what I've said that I think the fundamental problem that ails theology of religions is that the subdiscipline has failed to think about the category religion. I will argue that problems generated by the category as we use it in contemporary discourse are numerous and cannot be escaped until we learn to think more imaginatively. So let's begin. Having articulated rather long way what I'm up to for today. Now, the central field question is, are the various religions paths up the same mountain? When reframed out of the realm of metaphor into concept, the question means something like this: do the various religions, each in its own way, make access to salvation possible? John Hick, one of the field's founding figures, puts the question this way: are the various religions soteriological vehicles that make possible a movement from self-centeredness to reality-centeredness? Right. Do the religious traditions change us from being self-centered to reality-centered? Here the word reality is usually capitalized. Reality. Because that's a neutral term that stands in place of some word like God, which would be too tradition specific, right? You can't use that word when you're thinking across traditions. So something like ultimate reality is often used. All right, now let's quickly run through the major options in the field, and I think you'll see why they seem to be problematic. Now, Christian exclusivists, you can probably tell by the term which way they go, maintain that salvation comes only through explicit faith in Jesus Christ before death. In its churchly ecclesiological formulation, this position is known by the phrase extra ecclesiam nulla salus. Outside of the church, there is no salvation. Now, this position has been widely recognized as problematic because it has a hard time acknowledging the real transformative power of religious traditions, the power these traditions have to heal and sustain persons and communities. If we were to use very Christian language, we might speak of the fruits of the Spirit as evident in other religious traditions, but exclusivists have no real way of taking into account the fact that the fruits of the Spirit are found elsewhere. An exclusivist position also seems problematic because it makes genuine conversation between traditions undesirable. What is there to talk about with persons outside of one's tradition if just one tradition is true and all others false? If conversation or dialogue is at all possible within this framework, the only point of it would be apologetics, right? To disprove the positions of someone else for the sake, typically, of conversion. So a conversation might be possible, but the conversation is front-loaded with one and only one desirable goal: apologetics for the sake of conversion. Basically, confrontation and conversion are the only options if you begin from within an exclusivist position. The problem is also, the other major problem with this position is that it runs into classical internal Christian theological problems like theodicy. Does God really will the salvation of all persons, as Scripture also claims? If so, it would be contrary to God's will to set up a situation in which only persons who happen to be born into Christian communities could be saved. And then we're quickly into the land of the God of double predestination. God predestines some to be saved, most others to be damned. God is vulnerable to charges of arbitrariness. All manner of internal Christian problems come up from within the exclusivist position. So it doesn't recognize the fruits of the Spirit in other traditions. It doesn't really enable conversation. And it ties up Christian theology into knots because it can't really affirm what the Bible seems to want to affirm, that God really desires the salvation of all persons. All right, so that option doesn't seem compelling to most of us. Christian inclusivists, therefore, take another step, and they argue that God's saving presence and activity are to be found outside the boundaries of Christian community. By the way, you can probably see how you could have Buddhist inclusivists or other forms of inclusivists just ring the changes. So I can hint at how that would work. So Christian inclusivists argue that God's saving presence and activity are present outside the boundaries of the Christian community. A Buddhist might likewise say the grace of Amida Buddha is found elsewhere, or the Buddha shows himself in multiple ways and multiple fashions. Now, in the Christian context, the argument those made that salvation, wherever it is to be found, is accomplished in and through the work of the Christ or the Holy Spirit. So even if salvation is happening outside the church, it's happening by the reality that is best known by the church. So Christians typically argue that in Jesus the Christ, humanity has received the fullest and most adequate, indeed the finally adequate revelation of divine purposes. If God's saving work is found in other traditions, it's because Christ is present in some hidden or anonymous way in those traditions. Now, the strength of the inclusivist position is that inclusivists hold that it is possible that persons from other traditions might be saved. This seems like a marked improvement and a positive advance. The position also enables Christians to be faithful to their own fundamental convictions, right? The fullness of truth is found in one's own tradition, but rays of that truth, to use traditional Christian language, are to be found in other traditions. Unfortunately, almost all formulations of this position are captive to a part-whole logic. Right? Regardless of what kind of inclusivist you are, you're going to be in a position of saying your tradition understands in full what others understand only in part. The goods of other tradition, therefore, are partial and incomplete and find their fulfillment in Christianity. Now, I think this position, too, makes it very hard to be in conversation with persons in other religious traditions. What would be the motivation for dialogue? What have we to learn from other traditions if any element of saving truth found there is but a partial reflection of what we already know fully? On an inclusivist account, it's hard to see how interreligious dialogue can be a conversation between equals, marked by mutual respect. The possibility of deep and transformative learning from others seems largely foreclosed. Right? What can you genuinely learn that's new from others? You might engage in conversation to learn about others, but can you learn really from them if you feel like your tradition contains the fullness of the truth that others only know in part? So inclusivist positions do create openings to conversation that move beyond just apologetic contest and conversion, right? That's not, if there are real truths to be found there, and truths that are even capable of saving persons, you no longer have to engage in conversation that seeks to contest or to convert, but full conversations that leads to mutual transformation and learning, that seems still foreclosed. Genuine mutual dialogical encounter is hard if you maintain a position that appears to claim that we know your tradition better than you do. What we find interesting in your tradition is not what seems different from what we know in our own, but what is similar. Right? If you operate out of this fulfillment position, what you're going to find valuable in another tradition are those things that look like what you already know. Okay, yes, that's good stuff, good. But of course, here we have the thing fully shown, right? Again, the possibility of robust conversation with other religious traditions, especially a conversation that can take seriously what seems different in another tradition, seems to be foreclosed. The natural tendency in inclusivist position, therefore, seems to be to look for what confirms my own intuitions and convictions. And this does not seem to offer robust grounds for interreligious dialogue and learning. All right, so now we try the pluralist position, right? We've tried the exclusivist, that doesn't seem to do it for us. Tried the inclusivist, that seems problematic. Well, surely the most compelling position then is the pluralist one, and we'll try to run the pluralist position. Now, the most famous interlocutor in the pluralist camp is John Hick. He contends that the various religious traditions are, as I said already, soteriological vehicles that lead us from self-centeredness to reality-centeredness. And he argues that all the major religious traditions enable their adherents to make possible this transformation. And no tradition accomplishes this work in such a markedly superior fashion that that tradition would be justified in saying that it is somehow superior to all others. It's an interesting argument. He even has some empirical elements in it. He says that if it really were the case that Christian traditions were just producing luminary people, right? I mean, we were all like gorgeous human beings, lights out personalities, serving humanity in exemplary ways. And other traditions were like, eh. Then you could say, wow, the Christian tradition must surely be the superior tradition. But by and large, no tradition seems to generate saints at any more rapid clip than any other. We'll see your Mahatma Gandhi with our Mother Teresa. It all works out about even. And so Hicks says that we have no empirical grounds to believe that any one tradition really does a superior job to any other on which it could run a claim that Christianity or Buddhism is superior to any other. And the historical evils generated by our various traditions are pretty bad too. So even if you could say that one tradition has certain kinds of charms, Hinduism has thousands of years of the caste system. So on whole, these traditions seem to be no better than any others. But in them all, there does seem to be the possibility of moving from self-centeredness to reality-centeredness. That really does happen in all of them. And therefore, we have reasons to believe that all are making possible this transformation from self-centeredness to reality-centeredness. Okay, so far that sounds pretty good. We sound like we're in a place where we might actually be on relatively equal footing with other persons, and that is something to be desired because it might make equal conversation possible, a conversation of mutual respect. But here's the problem. At least in his formulation, he thinks that our various understandings of ultimate reality all fail to get at ultimate reality. His central philosophical claim is that all we have are our various images and concepts about ultimate reality, but what ultimate reality is in itself is entirely unknowable. We simply can't know what ultimate reality is. We just have our pictures about that reality. In technical philosophical language, and I'm by and large going to avoid that kind of language today, his claim is that we only have access to phenomenal manifestations of a noumenal real. He's a Kantian, for those of you who know the work of Immanuel Kant. So I might have a concept of ultimate reality that's personal. God is a person who loves. My Buddhist neighbor might have a impersonal concept of ultimate reality. The ultimate reality might be emptiness rather than a personal, loving God. But both of these concepts don't get at what God is in God's self. Ultimate reality is neither personal nor impersonal. It exceeds any concept that we might form about it. This is not to say that the religions are wrong to imagine and conceptualize the ultimate reality as personal or impersonal. We have to do that. We have to make up images, pictures, concepts, because we can't otherwise engage a reality that exceeds us. But that reality will always exceed all of these pictures, concepts, images. And, well, that sounds appealing in a certain way, but here's the problem. The problem is that we don't have anything to learn from each other. If my concept of ultimate reality, is infinitely far from what ultimate reality is, and yours is infinitely far, then why talk to each other? What have we to gain from engaging in real conversation? I don't think Hick has a very good answer to that. How does Hick even know that the various religions are oriented to one and the same reality, despite the very different accounts that each religion gives? Well, Hick's decisive claim is that the major religions all seem to make possible the same general transformation. So we have reason to believe that the same reality is happening, right? The same reality is making possible this transformation. But what that reality is will always exceed anything we have to say about it. Again, we have a situation where conversation seems foreclosed. At least conversation that leads to mutual learning and transformation. We might engage each other now in order to know each other better. We might engage each other for the sake of ethical neighborliness, to understand how you live your religious life or how you picture religious life, but we can't actually expect to learn anything about each other's way of imagining and thinking about ultimate reality. Also, the same thing happens to be the case for the disciplines, the spiritual disciplines we undertake in our various traditions. Since they all make the same transformation possible, we don't seem to have really good reasons to take seriously the difference between, say, Vipassana and Eucharist, right? Eucharist is my Christian way of moving from self-centeredness to reality-centeredness, and Vipassana is the Buddhist way, or yoga might be a Hindu way, right? They're all disciplines by which we are transformed. But what about the differences between these techniques? Do those matter? In fact, what's going on when a whole bunch of people in our contemporary moment seem to be doing more than one of these disciplines? Does he have an explanation for why people who do church also want to do yoga? So I gave a talk in Seattle at a congregation which I called Eucharist Upstairs, Yoga Downstairs. And they said, Dr. T, we do that here. Well, why? If all our traditions are basically generically doing the same thing, and these are just variant ways of doing the same thing, then how to explain the fact that people seem to be interested in the differences just because they are different, not just because they're same? I don't think he has a good answer for that too. Now, Hick is not saying that Eucharist is Vipassana or that God is Buddha nature. He's too careful a thinker to make such mistakes. What he fails to do is give us reasons to be seriously interested in the difference. It's like he wants us not to argue, right? He's so concerned that we don't waste our time arguing about our different conceptions that he disables even the possibility of mutual learning. It's like there's a curtain, a thick, impenetrable curtain between all our images of God and God. And there's no peeking behind the curtain. And that way we can't debate. Well, great, we can't debate, but we can't learn either. Does that make sense? That seems to be the problem that Hick's version runs into. Well, we've now surveyed 3 different options, and all of them don't seem to make possible anything like mutual learning. What about, might there be other options? Well, a wonderful scholar named Mark Heim suggests that, yes, there is another option that none of us have considered. Namely, that there may be more than one salvation, multiple salvations. His way of putting that matter is to suggest that maybe we're all mountain climbing, but we're not climbing the same mountain. Right? What if it is the case that our various different religions really do matter, really do make transformation possible, are desirable, good in themselves, but don't take up the same project? What if there are multiple salvations? That's the possibility that Heim wants to raise to our consideration. He says that there's a secret agreement between exclusivists, really conservative folks, and really liberal folks. Namely, there's only one thing that could possibly be worth having. The only argument is, does everybody have it? Or is it just my tradition? Got that? Right? Like, there's a secret agreement between the most liberal types and the most conservative types that there's only one thing worth having. And their only disagreement is whether we all have it or whether just my tradition has access to that precious good. Mark says, what if there are many different good things to be had in the world's religious traditions and they're not identical? So we might all be mountain climbing, but we're not climbing the same mountain. This seems like an interesting approach. I actually think this is, of the extant approach, is one of the more interesting and compelling ones. You can see why, right? Like, if you're climbing a different mountain and you're up to something really good, but different than mine, now I might have reason to figure out what you're doing and what there might be to be gained by imaging ultimate reality as you do, engaging in the practices you do. Difference now begins to matter a great deal. This model is variously called the acceptance model, accept that there are real differences, or the particularity model, accept that there are real particularities across traditions, and they can't all be equated. Now, as I said, this seems a very promising option, and it gets us going and it loosens up our imagination beyond certain kinds of homogeneities. But I have a feeling that even this particular approach has a deep problem. And I'll try to articulate that in a moment. Now, I've surveyed the 4 sort of major options out there. And I want to now suggest what I think is the common flaw behind all of these options, including this last one. and then try to help us think about how to get around this problem. I don't think I'm going to offer solutions. I'm just going to point us on the way to a solution. All right. Now, each of these options, including Mark Hymes, is plagued, I think, by at least two major fatal flaws, although some version of what Hymes tries may be workable. What are these flaws? What do I think is really going wrong here? Now, the first of these flaws is so deep that I shall have to put off serious discussion of it for just a few minutes, but I'll name it now. Here's the problem. It's not clear that the other traditions that theologians have in mind are religions, or would have recognized themselves as being religions until rather recently in human history. Now, I have to repeat that because it's such a momentous statement that it is worthy of repeating. When we make a list like Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, Christianity, we think all of these things are just like the other. They're all parts, they're all religions. They're all variations of the same general project called religion. Well, it's not clear that any of these traditions would have recognized themselves until rather recently as even being religions. Most of the world's languages did not even have a word for this notion called religion until encounter with the West, and then they had to make up candidate terms from their own traditions and languages to fill in for the work that we were doing with the word religion. And it's not clear that there was any word there or any set of words or terms that would actually fulfill that function. So if you asked persons, well, what is your religion? By and large, even if you tried successfully to get that translation done, it's not clear that anybody would have understood what question you were asking them, because the category is relatively new in human history. That, I think, is the major problem with this whole field and the way it goes about its work. Now, I'm going to put that on hold for a second and then come back to that problem, because that's really huge. The second major flaw, and it's a related one, is that theologians seem to talk as though each of these religions is internally homogeneous. Even in Hymes' multiple mountains or multiple salvations option, there's the suggestion that every religion has just one thing that everybody in the tradition wants. Right? They're all climbing one mountain. All Christians are climbing the Christian mountain. All Buddhists are climbing the Buddhist mountain. Really, people? Does it look that way to you? This problem confounds me. Theologians of religions are plagued by a peculiar blindness when they are best placed to know better. What they don't seem to register is that the religions are marked by profound internal diversity. For example, Christian theologians should know that there is no Christian consensus about what salvation is and how it is to be accomplished. Never in Christian history has there been a pan-Christian document that ever agreed to as to what constitutes salvation. We argue about this tooth and nail all the time. And the arguments are fierce. Why don't theologians of religions get that? Why do they keep talking as though every tradition has but one sort of soteriological aim? This problem of not seeing internal diversity seems everywhere. And no tradition that I have studied is exempt from this reality. Certainly Hinduism has on offer multiple conceptions of moksha, of what liberation constitutes. Is it union or non-duality with ultimate reality? Is it devotion to ultimate reality? And there are real deep debates within these traditions. And to imagine that the real differences show up across the boundary line between one religion and the other seems to me profoundly mistaken. What's going on here? I think that people like my colleagues, these very eminent theologians whom I've mentioned, are all falling into the distorting gravitational pull of the category religion. I think this problem too is related to the idea of religion, that each religion is a homogeneity. Now, a growing number of religious studies scholars have been voicing pressing concerns about the whole category religion. Almost at the same time as this literature that I've been surveying today with you, a second parallel body of literatures emerged that explored the history and genealogy of the category religion. The great thinkers in this field include people like Wilfred Cantwell Smith and more recently the anthropologist Talal Asad. These historians and genealogists of religions have been raising far-reaching questions. Unfortunately, theologians of religions have not taken this new literature seriously. So what do these new thinkers have to teach us? Here are some of the key ideas that are to be found in this literature. The category religion is not universally applicable, and we make grave mistakes when we use the category to name and describe non-Western traditions. That's one major argument that's being made in the literature. A second major argument is that even the so-called Western traditions may not always have been religions and may be distorted when conceptualized as religions. Whoa, what? Even Christianity hasn't always been a religion? Right? It may have become a religion rather recently? I'll try to say something about that. The origins of the category are Western, and although there's considerable debate about dating the origins of the category, I think I belong to the school of those who believe that it's not just a Christian category. I think it's a modern category. It's a recent category of modern origin. Other cultures do not carve up the world as we do, and so are unlikely to recognize our distinctions between the social, the political, and the religious. But in the West, the categories religious and secular are, as Talal Asad says, Siamese twins. We can't think one of these categories without thinking of the other. When we designate some part, aspect, or province of life as religious, we simultaneously have in mind other parts of our life which we regard as secular or not religious, right? So just the very moment you say, now I'm being religious, now I'm being political or economic, right, you are making up the distinction between some parts of life which are religious and some parts that are secular or not religious. In other words, persons have to be taught to think of some parts of life as non-religious or secular in order to think of other parts of life as the really religious parts of life. Does that make sense to you? So, for example, if you ask for most of the history of Christianity, is the question how much interest we should charge a religious question, or is it an economic question? People would scratch their heads at you. What do you mean? Even if you could get them to understand these two terms, they would probably say, well, it's both. It's not one or the other, right? You can't say that it is a economic question because there used to be these things called usury laws. And so the distinction between some parts of our life, well, when I'm being economic, then I'm not being religious. But when I'm praying, I am being religious. Well, we had to learn to think of life in these dichotomous ways. And other traditions did not make these distinctions in quite the same way. And we see this reflected in our talk about other religious traditions quite often. And I'll get to that point. In the West, we have learned to place the political, the economic, and the broadly social spheres of life within the secular domain. Each of these parts of life is subject in the modern West to putatively scientific disciplines. So if you want to think about politics, you don't go to church, you go to the political theorist. If you want to think about economics, you go to the economist. If you want to think about society, you go to the sociologist and the anthropologist. In so doing, we affirm that these provinces are not the business of religion. In other words, the religious is depicted as qualitatively different from the political. What makes religion essentially different, we assert, is that it has to do with the transcendent or the sacred. The flight of the alone to the alone. I'm always looking up when I'm being religious, or maybe because I'm a Tillichian who believes that God is the ground of being, I should look down. You know? But either way, I'm not looking here in the middle ground where we're living our common and collective life. So when theologians ask whether the various religions are leading us to salvation, do you see that salvation here is already privatized, transcendentalized? It's sort of like something that has to do with after you kick off, right? Part of what's happened when we invented religion is that we have taken it to mean something to do with post-mortem access to God or heaven or nirvana or moksha. Is that what Jesus cared about? Is that what Muhammad cared about? We see this understanding of religion emerging as it is being created in the late 17th century, for example, in the writings of John Locke, whose influence on our founding fathers is well appreciated. So John Locke writes this, and listen to this, in his famous letter concerning toleration. He writes, quote, "I esteem it above all things necessary to distinguish exactly the business of civil government from that of religion, and to settle the just bounds that lie between one and the other." Okay. All right. Do you see what he's saying? Like, there's something that the civil magistrate, that's his business. And then there's other things that the priest deals with. In Locke's scheme, religion would ideally not be part of the political world at all. He claimed, and this is a quote, "The care of souls cannot belong to the civil magistrate, because his power consists only in outward force, but true and saving religion consists in the inward persuasion of the mind." Now, it's an astonishing set of sentences in the letter concerning toleration, because I think that's one of the documents in which we're making up the distinction between the religious and the political, right? The magistrate is concerned with all these other things, but care of the souls, that's what you go to the priest for. Here we see not the separation of religion and the state, but the invention of the very idea of religion in our modern sense as a private matter in the life of souls, which has nothing to do with the public civic realm, which falls under the power of the magistrate. These Western habits of thought are, as I've said, don't work for others. And so when we try to impose these distinctions on other cultural complexes, we run into problems. Once these distinctions are securely in place and taken for granted, it's easy to characterize traditions that do not recognize and abide by our distinctions as, what's the word we use for people who get the political and the economic and the religious confused? We have a word for those people. Yes, they are the fundamentalists. Woo, right? Why? Right? Because they are confusing, right? The political, the economic, and the religious. Well, wait a minute, we made up that distinction, right? And the idea that others should abide by this distinction and should not mix politics and religion presupposes that these things are really separable in the first place. Or we say that a person or tradition is using religion to advance his or her political agenda. When we speak in this fashion, we mean to signal that what's really going on is something political. Religious language, we say, is functioning as a cynical veneer, a coating, a disguise for other agenda. Well, what if the aim of a tradition or thinker, well, let's say Jesus or Muhammad, is not about to bring about some kind of life after death, but a transformation of human societies in the direction of justice? Right? I mean, if you actually read the New Testament, Jesus has very little to say about what to do when you kick off, you know. This is not the primary concern. It's not, I'll fly away, oh glory, I'll fly away. When I die, hallelujah, by and by, I'll fly away. No, sorry. It's a good song, I really like it. But it's theologically tricky because it rather quickly confines salvation as a matter of private, right? Private salvation, whereas what Muhammad and Jesus and most of the other religious thinkers we're aware of, the people we think of as religious thinkers, we're concerned about comprehensive human well-being. And therefore we're not able to make the distinction between the parts of our life that are religious and the parts of our life that are not. So I'm realizing that our time for conversation must be made, but I think this imposing of the category religion is distorting our conversation with other traditions. It's distorting our capacity to even recognize the internal diversity within our own tradition. We have forgotten to understand the ways in which, by a variety of mechanisms, usually imposed by colonialism, we have taught persons in other parts of the world to imagine their lives as by appeal to the category religion. And you know, the census in India, which asks people to check which religion they are. The problem that the British ran into immediately, that people checked more than one box, right? That hundreds of thousands of people checked that they were Mohammedan Hindus, which I always think of driving some British administrator batty. What are these people doing? Don't they know it's not possible to be simultaneously Muslim and Hindu? Right? The category religion seems to be responsible even for the idea that you can only be one religion at a time. When most of the human species has engaged in modalities of religious living in which they have been inspired by multiple traditions simultaneously. It makes no sense in East Asia to be just Buddhist or just Confucian. It depends on what you're doing. Are you burying your ancestor? Well, then you go to the Buddhists for that. But if you're engaging in ancestor veneration, well, the Confucians have the lock on that, So the idea that you can only be one religion at a time, that each religion only has one religious aim, all of these ideas are, I think, open to interrogation. And I have ways of doing and thinking about that. But right now, in this talk, I want to diagnose the problem. That we won't get very far in the conversation that this building wants to get launched if we assume that the category religion is valid for all of these religious traditions. It might be best to say that what our religions are more like pantries and spice cabinets than they are like an authentic, a central metaphysical doctrine or salvational premises. Our traditions are repertoires, and we do things with our repertoires like the way we do things with our spice cabinets. So I cook Indian food. I think Amy also does. And so, we've got a bunch of stuff up in there. Cumin, coriander, nutmeg. The list goes on in a decent Indian household. But when we make up chicken curry, presumably even the same chicken curry, it won't taste precisely the same because we're going to use those spices differently. What if each of our traditions is more like a spice cabinet and a pantry than it is like a doctrine? There is no Christian worldview. Christians use Christian ingredients to cook up Christian worldviews. Does that make sense? If that's true, then it may be that some Christian worldviews are rather like some Hindu ones. Not only because certain kinds of possibilities might be perennially human ones. Like Christian mystics sound like Advaita Vedantins, right? There are Christian theologians who think that the point of Christian life is to realize that at the deep foundational levels of the soul, there is no distinction between soul and divinity. There are whole traditions in Hinduism that, for which that is the central idea. They're using Christian ingredients to cook up something that tastes very Hindu, let's say. And Hindus use their repertoire to cook up things that often taste very Christian. Now add to that the fact that the ingredients in our pantries move, right? Like, if there are any decent cooks in this room, I mean, like, pretty much now all of you have cumin, right? Because, you can't really cook without, you got to have cumin, So it's often the case that the ingredients within our various religious traditions are also moving across the boundaries. In fact, where are these boundaries between religions? Are religions the sort of things that have boundaries? Now, I think these are the kinds of questions we have to start asking ourselves, especially in an age in which the old distinctions between religion and politics, religion and economics, are now becoming highly fluid. When we think with these more fluid categories, I think we will find better options than the ones that I've named so far. And if you want to know what some of those options are, you'll have to buy my next book. He tantalizingly leaves the thing open. Thank you.